December 15th, 1944. A freezing Belgian hillside. 4 American soldiers armed with nothing but rifles and 1 Browning automatic rifle stood watching a 25-ton German Panzer IV tank crawling up the slope toward their position. They had no anti-tank weapons, no artillery support, no reinforcements coming. By every calculation known to military science, they were already dead men. But one of those soldiers was a 17-year-old black farm boy from rural Alabama, who had spent his entire childhood doing something that no military academy in the world could teach. He had been moving 2,000-pound oak logs down 40-degree slopes, using nothing but chains, pulleys, and an intimate understanding of how gravity works. What happened next would become one of the most bizarre tank kills in the entire history of World War II. A German tank literally snapped in half. Not by a bomb, not by another tank, not by any weapon the military had ever designed, but by a logging chain and the simple laws of physics that a teenage farm boy understood better than German engineers who had spent years designing that very tank. Before we dive into this incredible story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you are watching from. It really helps support the channel. The winter of 1944 was supposed to be quiet on the Western Front. Allied commanders believed the Germans were finished. They were wrong. On December 16, 1944, Hitler launched his last desperate gamble. Over 200,000 German soldiers and more than 600 tanks smashed through the thinly defended Ardennes forest in what would become known as the Battle of the Bulge. American units were caught completely off guard. Entire divisions were surrounded. Communication lines were cut. Supply depots were overrun. In the first 48 hours alone, thousands of American soldiers were killed, wounded, or captured. The Germans were advancing at a pace that shocked Allied high command. Their plan was simple, but devastating. Punch through the American lines, capture the vital port of Antwerp, and split the Allied forces in two. If they succeeded, it could extend the war by months or even years. But the success of this massive offensive depended on one critical factor: speed. The Germans needed to capture key roads and hilltops before American reinforcements could arrive. One of those strategic positions was a small hill designated Hill 212, overlooking the main road between Malmedy and Stavelot. German military planners had identified this hill as essential for their advance toward the Meuse River. Whoever controlled Hill 212 controlled the road below. And on the morning of December 15th, just one day before the main German offensive began, the only Americans defending that critical position were 4 men from a recovery unit who had been sent there to set up an equipment salvage point. They were not combat troops. They were mechanics and equipment operators. Their job was to recover damaged vehicles, not fight German tanks. But none of them knew that a German tank column was already moving toward their position through the morning mist. The young soldier who would change everything that day was James Washington. He had been born in 1927 in the rural town of Huntsville, Alabama, where his family operated a small timber business alongside their cotton farm. From the age of 8, young James had been working alongside his father and older brothers in one of the most dangerous occupations in America: moving massive logs down steep mountain slopes. This was not work for the weak or the careless. One mistake with a 2,000-pound log on a 40-degree slope, and you were dead. The log would roll over you, or the chain would snap and whip back with enough force to cut a man in half. James learned to calculate weight distribution the way other children learned their multiplication tables. He could look at a slope and tell you exactly what angle you needed to lower a log safely. He could examine a chain and identify stress points that would fail under load. By the time he was 15 years old, James Washington could do things with chains and heavy objects that engineering graduates struggled to understand. These skills were not taught in any textbook. They were learned through years of dangerous work where a single miscalculation meant death. In October 1943, James walked into a Montgomery recruitment office and lied about his age. He told the sergeant he was 18. At 6 feet 2 inches tall and 190 pounds of solid muscle from years of farm labor, James looked older than his 16 years. The recruitment officer, more interested in meeting quotas than checking birth certificates, barely glanced at him before stamping his papers. James was assigned to the 751st Tank Battalion, but not as a tank crewman. His commanders quickly recognized that this young soldier from Alabama had an almost supernatural understanding of mechanical leverage and weight distribution. He was assigned to a specialized recovery unit responsible for retrieving damaged vehicles from impossible situations. What nobody understood yet was that James Washington was about to apply those same timber hauling skills to a problem that no military manual had ever addressed: how to kill a tank without any weapons. At approximately 10:30 on the morning of December 15th, Sergeant Michael O'Brien received a radio report that German forces had been spotted moving east of their position. Minutes later, James heard a sound that made his blood run cold: the deep rumble of diesel engines and the metallic clatter of tank tracks on frozen ground. Coming from the wrong direction. O'Brien grabbed his binoculars and saw a column of German tanks approaching up the main road. The lead vehicle was a Panzer IV medium tank, followed by at least 2 more armored vehicles obscured by the morning mist. The sergeant quickly assessed their situation and realized they had almost no options. Their small arms were useless against armor. Their .150 caliber machine gun would barely scratch the paint on a German tank. Radio contact with headquarters was intermittent. No reinforcements were coming. They could run and hope to escape through the woods. They could hide and pray the Germans passed by. Or they could die fighting with weapons that could not possibly hurt the enemy. But while O'Brien was calculating their odds of survival, James Washington was staring at the approaching tank with different eyes. He was not seeing an invincible war machine. He was seeing a 25-ton object climbing a steep slope. And in that moment, something clicked in his mind. Something that had nothing to do with military training and everything to do with moving logs in the Alabama wilderness. James turned to his sergeant and said words that must have sounded absolutely insane. He said he could stop that tank with a chain. O'Brien's first reaction was disbelief. The idea of using a recovery chain against a German tank sounded like something from a fever dream, not a battlefield tactic. But James was already explaining, speaking quickly, but with a confidence that came from years of practical experience. He described how a heavy object on a steep slope creates enormous stress when its momentum is suddenly arrested. He explained how the recovery chain rated for 50-ton loads could be used to create a mechanical trap that would turn the tank's own weight against it. He showed O'Brien how the terrain, the angle of the road, and the configuration of their equipment could be combined to create forces that would exceed the structural limits of the tank's hull. The plan sounded crazy. It violated everything that conventional military doctrine taught about anti-tank warfare. But O'Brien was a practical man, facing certain death with no practical alternatives. He gave James permission to try. They had less than 15 minutes before the German tank would reach their position. James and Corporal David Chen grabbed the heavy recovery chain and raced down the hillside to position it. The chain weighed over 400 pounds and stretched nearly 200 feet when fully extended. Each link was forged from high-carbon steel rated to handle loads of up to 50 tons. James had inspected every link that morning, identifying the strongest points and calculating exactly how much stress the chain could withstand. They positioned the chain at a specific point on the road where James had calculated the tank would be at maximum mechanical disadvantage. This was where the road made a sharp turn while climbing at its steepest gradient. At this exact spot, the tank's 25-ton mass would be working against it, creating enormous gravitational force that the German crew would not even notice until it was too late. Meanwhile, Sergeant O'Brien and Private Tommy Rodriguez prepared the anchor system using the wrecker truck's powerful winch. James had designed a pulley system that would multiply the force of the winch by approximately 10 times. When activated, the system would pull the chain taut with enough force to stop a freight train. The timing had to be perfect. James calculated that he would have exactly 3 seconds from the moment he gave the signal until the chain became fully taut. During those 3 seconds, the tank would travel approximately 15 meters. Signal too early, and the German crew would see the chain in reverse. Signal too late, and the tank would pass the optimal position. James positioned himself at a concealed observation point, where he could watch the tank's approach. His heart was pounding, but his mind was calm. Running calculations the same way he had done 1,000 times on Alabama mountainsides. The German tank was commanded by Oberfeldwebel Fritz Weber, a 24-year-old veteran who had seen action in virtually every major campaign of the war. His crew was experienced and confident. Their Panzer IV carried thick armor and a powerful 75mm cannon. Weber had absolutely no reason to expect any serious resistance from what intelligence reported was a lightly defended logistics position. He could not have been more wrong. As the tank rounded the final switchback and began climbing the steepest section of road, James gave the signal. The wrecker truck's winch engaged with a sharp mechanical whine. The recovery chain snapped taut across the road directly in front of the tank. And then physics took over. The tank struck the chain at full climbing speed. Inside the vehicle, the sudden deceleration threw the crew forward against their equipment. Driver Klaus Hoffmann tried to reverse, but James had anticipated this reaction. The winch was already applying massive rearward force through the pulley system, creating tension in the chain that far exceeded anything the tank could resist. For approximately 2 seconds, the tank remained motionless against the chain, its tracks spinning uselessly on the frozen ground. Then the accumulated gravitational force multiplied by the mechanical advantage of the pulley system began to exceed the structural limits of the tank's hull. The failure started at the transmission, where the enormous rearward force cracked the housing. This created a cascade effect as other structural elements failed in rapid succession. Within 5 seconds, the recovery chain was cutting into the tank's side armor. The steel links under 50 tons of tension and applied at precisely the right angle concentrated force on a small area that the armor was never designed to withstand. The armor could stop a projectile traveling at high speed, but it could not resist the sustained pressure of a steel chain under massive tension. 15 seconds after the initial impact, the impossible happened. The German Panzer IV tank split in half. The front section containing the driver's compartment separated completely from the rear section containing the engine. The front portion immediately began sliding backward down the slope, while the rear section remained on the road, its engine still running but connected to nothing. A 25-ton German tank had been destroyed by a 17-year-old farm boy using techniques he learned hauling timber in Alabama. No bombs, no anti-tank guns, just chains, pulleys, and a perfect understanding of physics that no military academy had ever taught. But the celebration was short-lived, because that first tank was not alone. Through the morning mist, James could see another Panzer IV advancing up the road, followed by more vehicles behind it. The German column was larger than they had feared, and now the enemy knew something was wrong. The second tank commander, Unteroffizier Johann Richter, had heard the crash and seen debris flying from the lead tank's position. He halted his advance and attempted to establish radio contact with Weber, receiving only silence in response. James looked at the chain system he had just used. It was still intact, but positioned incorrectly to repeat the same tactic. Repositioning it would take time they did not have, and would expose his men to fire from the approaching tank. The element of surprise that had made his first success possible was rapidly disappearing. Sergeant O'Brien was already calculating evacuation routes when James spoke again. He had another idea. A modification of his original plan that might work against the second tank if they moved fast enough. The German tank was approaching more cautiously now, but it was still climbing the same slope, still subject to the same laws of physics. And James Washington was not finished yet. What happened next would demonstrate that the destruction of the first tank was not a fluke, but the Germans were learning, and the tactical situation was about to become far more dangerous. In Part 2, we will see how James adapted his unconventional tactics against an increasingly alert enemy, how the arrival of American reinforcements transformed the battle, and how one teenage farm boy's understanding of leverage and gravity would ultimately help disrupt German offensive operations throughout the entire region. The Battle of the Bulge was just beginning, and James Washington was about to become a legend that the military would study for decades to come. In Part 1, we witnessed something that should have been impossible. A 17-year-old black farm boy from Alabama named James Washington used a logging chain to literally snap a German Panzer IV tank in half. No bombs, no anti-tank guns, just physics leverage and skills learned hauling timber down mountain slopes. But one destroyed tank was not enough. A second German tank was already approaching, and behind it an entire column of armored vehicles was preparing to assault Hill 212. The element of surprise was gone. The Germans knew something had destroyed their lead tank, and James Washington had less than 10 minutes to figure out how to repeat his impossible feat against an enemy that was now on high alert. What happened next would test not just his engineering skills, but his ability to adapt under pressure in ways that would leave military historians scratching their heads for decades. And this is where everything became far more dangerous. Unteroffizier Johann Richter was not a fool. The 28-year-old tank commander had survived 3 years of combat on the Eastern Front before being transferred to the Western Theater. He had seen comrades die in burning tanks. He had learned to never underestimate an enemy. When his radio calls to Oberfeldwebel Weber went unanswered, Richter immediately recognized that something catastrophic had happened to the lead tank. He halted his Panzer IV approximately 200 meters from the debris field and began scanning the hillside through his commander's cupola. What he observed made no sense. There were no signs of anti-tank gun positions, no craters from artillery strikes, no wreckage patterns consistent with a mine detonation. Instead, he saw what appeared to be pieces of Weber's tank scattered across the road in a configuration that suggested the vehicle had simply broken apart from the middle. Richter reported his observations to Major Heinrich Müller, who was commanding the German column from the third tank in line. Müller's response was immediate and cautious. He ordered Richter to advance slowly, while the rest of the column provided overwatch. German doctrine emphasized aggressive action, but Müller had not survived 4 years of war by being reckless. Something about this situation felt wrong. Meanwhile, on the hilltop, Sergeant O'Brien was watching the German hesitation with growing anxiety. Every second the enemy delayed was another second for potential reinforcements to arrive. But every second also gave the Germans more time to figure out what had happened and develop countermeasures. O'Brien turned to James Washington and asked a simple question. "Can you do it again?" James studied the tactical situation with the same analytical mind that had calculated stress loads on logging chains since childhood. The recovery chain was still intact, but it was now positioned incorrectly. The first trap had been set at the optimal point on the road, where gradient and curve alignment created maximum mechanical disadvantage for any vehicle. Repositioning the 400-pound chain to that same location would take at least 15 minutes, and would expose his team to direct observation from the German tanks below. But James had not survived Alabama timber operations by being rigid in his thinking. When one approach failed, you found another. He examined the terrain around their current position and began calculating alternatives. The hilltop clearing where they had established their recovery post offered different possibilities than the road below. The wrecker truck was still operational. The secondary chains and cables were still available, and the steep western slope of the hill dropped away sharply into a wooded valley. An idea began forming in James's mind. It was different from his first trap, but based on the same fundamental principles: weight-gravity leverage and the structural limitations of machines designed for flat terrain combat. He turned to O'Brien and outlined his modified plan. Instead of setting a trap on the road below, they would lure the German tank up to the hilltop clearing and use the western slope as their weapon. The wrecker truck could serve as bait, appearing to be an easy target for the advancing Germans. When the tank committed to the assault on their position, James would deploy a lateral chain snare designed to catch the vehicle's tracks at precisely the moment when it was most vulnerable to being dragged sideways toward the steep drop. O'Brien listened with the same skepticism he had felt during James's first proposal. The plan sounded even more insane than the original. But the sergeant had just watched a German tank split in half using techniques that no military manual had ever described. He was no longer in a position to dismiss anything this young soldier suggested. The preparation took less than 8 minutes. James positioned the secondary recovery chain in a concealed trench approximately 30 meters from the edge of the western slope. The chain was connected to the wrecker truck's winch through a series of pulleys that would allow rapid deployment with maximum force. Corporal Chen and Private Rodriguez took positions with their small arms not to damage the approaching tank, but to create the appearance of a desperate defensive action that might encourage the German crew to press their attack aggressively. The bait was set. Now, they needed the Germans to take it. Richter's Panzer IV resumed its advance approximately 6 minutes after the initial halt. The tank commander had received orders from Major Muller to investigate the debris field and secure the hilltop position. German infantry would follow once the armored threat assessment was complete. As Richter's tank approached the wreckage of Weber's vehicle, his gunner Ludwig Becker kept the main gun trained on the American position above. Through his periscope, Becker could see movement among the rocks and equipment at the summit. He reported what appeared to be American soldiers manning a defensive perimeter around a large truck. Richter made his tactical assessment. The Americans had somehow destroyed the lead tank, possibly using a concealed anti-tank weapon that had not yet been identified. But they appeared to be lightly armed and were clearly preparing for a last-stand defense of their position. Standard German doctrine called for aggressive assault against demoralized defenders. Richter ordered driver Otto Neumann to bypass the debris field and proceed directly up the slope toward the American position. The Panzer IV's engine roared as Neumann applied full throttle to climb the increasingly steep gradient. James watched the approaching tank through his binoculars with focused concentration. He had calculated that the German vehicle would reach the optimal position for his trap in approximately 90 seconds. The tank would need to traverse a slight rise before entering the clearing, and at that moment, the vehicle would be climbing at maximum gradient while also negotiating a lateral slope that tilted it slightly toward the western drop-off. This was the moment of maximum vulnerability. James had identified a specific rock formation that would serve as his trigger marker. When the tank's front glacis plate aligned with that rock, he would signal for chain deployment. The timing had to be even more precise than his first trap, because this technique relied on lateral force rather than direct resistance. Chen and Rodriguez opened fire with their carbines as the tank approached their rounds, sparking harmlessly off the thick armor, but creating the impression of desperate resistance. Inside the Panzer IV, Richter felt confident that his assault was proceeding according to plan. The American small arms fire was ineffective, and his tank would reach the summit within seconds. He ordered Becker to prepare to engage the American truck with the main gun once they crested the rise. The tank climbed the final slope and entered the clearing. James watched the front glacis plate move toward the marker rock. His hand was raised ready to give the signal. 10 meters, 5 meters, alignment, now. The wrecker truck's winch engaged with a sharp metallic scream. The recovery chain deployed from its concealed position, whipping across the ground toward the tank's left track assembly. The timing was perfect. The chain caught between the track and the road wheels at precisely the moment when the tank was positioned on the slight lateral slope, with its center of gravity already shifted toward the western edge. The effect was immediate and devastating. The chain created a mechanical bind that the track system could not overcome. The left track was forced off its drive sprockets, eliminating the tank's ability to resist the lateral force now being applied by the tensioned chain. The Panzer IV began sliding sideways toward the steep western slope. Driver Neumann desperately tried to compensate by applying full power to the remaining functional track, but this only accelerated the tank's sideways momentum. The 25-ton vehicle was now being dragged toward a drop that its designers had never anticipated it would encounter. Richter screamed orders to his crew as he realized what was happening. The tank was sliding out of control toward what appeared to be a near vertical drop into the valley below. He ordered immediate evacuation, but the tank's sideways motion made it nearly impossible for the crew to open their hatches against the shifting gravity. The Panzer IV reached the edge of the western slope and tipped forward. For a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, the massive vehicle balanced on the precipice. Then, gravity won. The tank tumbled forward down the steep slope, rolling end over end through the trees and rocks. The sounds of tearing metal, shattering equipment, and exploding ammunition echoed across the valley, as 25 tons of German engineering was reduced to scattered wreckage at the bottom of the hill. James Washington had just destroyed his second German tank in less than 30 minutes, using nothing but chains terrain and an understanding of physics that no military academy had ever taught. 2 tanks, 0 anti-tank weapons, 1 teenage farm boy from Alabama. Major Muller watched the destruction of Richter's tank through his binoculars with something approaching disbelief. He had now lost 2 Panzer IV tanks to an American position that intelligence had reported as lightly defended by non-combat personnel. The nature of the threat remained unclear, but the results were undeniable. His carefully planned assault on Hill 212 had become a tactical disaster before the main offensive had even begun. Muller made the difficult decision that would save what remained of his command. He ordered an immediate halt to the advance and requested artillery support from higher headquarters. Until the nature of the American defensive capability could be identified and countered, further armored assault would be suicidal. The German column pulled back to a safe distance and began establishing defensive positions while waiting for reinforcement. This tactical pause gave James Washington and his 3 fellow soldiers something they desperately needed: time. The radio operator, Private Rodriguez, finally succeeded in establishing reliable contact with American forces approximately 8 kilometers to the west. His urgent message describing German tank losses and requesting immediate support reached the headquarters of the 751st Tank Battalion within minutes. Lieutenant Colonel William Matthews, the battalion commander, was initially skeptical of reports describing German tanks destroyed by unconventional methods. But the confirmation that enemy armor was advancing in his sector demanded immediate response, regardless of how the previous tanks had been eliminated. Matthews ordered a platoon of Sherman tanks under First Lieutenant Robert Taylor to investigate and reinforce the isolated position on Hill 212. Taylor's relief force arrived approximately 90 minutes after the destruction of the second German tank. The young lieutenant had pushed his Shermans hard through difficult terrain, aware that American soldiers were isolated and facing an unknown enemy threat. What he found when he reached the hilltop defied everything his armor school training had taught him. 4 exhausted soldiers, 2 destroyed German tanks, and a 17-year-old black private who calmly explained how he had used logging chains to eliminate enemy armor. Taylor's initial reaction was identical to what Sergeant O'Brien had felt hours earlier: disbelief, followed by reluctant acceptance as the evidence became undeniable. The wreckage of the first German tank was still visible on the road below, clearly split into 2 sections. The second tank's remains were scattered across the valley floor. Neither destruction pattern matched any known anti-tank weapon or tactic. Taylor questioned James extensively about the mechanical principles involved. The young soldier explained using the same straightforward language he would have used to describe moving logs in Alabama: weight distribution, leverage ratios, stress concentration points, structural failure thresholds. To James, these were not theoretical concepts, but practical realities he had lived with since childhood. Taylor recognized that he was dealing with something genuinely unprecedented. He immediately radioed a detailed report to battalion headquarters and requested that James Washington be brought to the attention of higher command for debriefing. But the tactical situation allowed no time for extensive analysis. The German column was still positioned less than a kilometer away, and additional enemy forces could arrive at any moment. The combination of Taylor's Sherman tanks with James Washington's unconventional expertise created a defensive capability that the Germans were completely unprepared to counter. Taylor positioned his armor to provide conventional anti-tank coverage, while James prepared additional chain traps at key positions along the approach routes. The American position on Hill 212 was rapidly transforming from a vulnerable logistics post into a layered defensive strongpoint. Major Mueller's request for artillery support was partially fulfilled when a battery of German 105mm howitzers began bombarding the American position approximately 45 minutes after Taylor's arrival. The shelling was intense but brief, as German ammunition supplies needed to be conserved for the larger offensive operations scheduled to begin the following day. The American defenders took cover in prepared positions and suffered no casualties from the bombardment. When the artillery fire ceased, Mueller launched his final assault on Hill 212. His remaining forces included 2 Panzer IV tanks, several self-propelled guns, and 2 companies of mechanized infantry. The assault was met by a combination of Sherman tank fire and James Washington's mechanical traps that proved absolutely devastating. The 3rd German tank to attempt the ascent struck a chain obstacle that James had positioned using lessons learned from his previous successes. The vehicle suffered catastrophic track failure and structural damage that left it completely immobilized. Taylor's Shermans engaged the remaining German armor at ranges that favored the American defenders, destroying 1 more tank and forcing the self-propelled guns to retreat. The German infantry assault was broken up by coordinated small arms fire from the reinforced American position. By late afternoon on December 15, 1944, Major Muller's Kampfgruppe had lost 3 tanks destroyed and 1 immobilized without achieving any of its tactical objectives. The German officer made the decision that would end the engagement. He ordered a complete withdrawal to regroup and report the unexpected American capabilities to higher headquarters. The German retreat from Hill 212 marked the end of immediate combat operations in that sector, but it also marked the beginning of something far more significant. James Washington's unconventional tactics had not just saved 4 American lives. They had disrupted German offensive timetables in a critical sector of what would become the Battle of the Bulge. The delay imposed on Muller's Kampfgruppe prevented the capture of strategic terrain that German planners had expected to control by the end of December 15th. This delay cascaded through the German offensive schedule, affecting coordination with adjacent units and contributing to the overall failure of the surprise attack to achieve its ambitious objectives. Lieutenant Taylor's after-action report on the engagement at Hill 212 would eventually reach the attention of senior American military leadership. The report described in unprecedented detail the mechanical principles that a teenage farm boy had applied to destroy enemy armor. But as word of James Washington's achievement spread through American forces in the region, it attracted attention of a different kind. German intelligence officers, debriefing the survivors of Muller's Kampfgruppe, were initially dismissive of reports describing tanks cut in half by chains. The accounts sounded like combat stress hallucinations or deliberate misinformation, but the consistent testimony from multiple sources forced German analysts to take the report seriously. Within 48 hours, German engineers were developing theoretical models to explain how such destruction might be possible. And within a week, counter-tactics designed to defeat chain-based anti-tank methods were being distributed to German armored units throughout the Western Front. James Washington had achieved something remarkable, but the Germans were learning, and they were already planning their response. In Part 3, we will see how German intelligence identified the threat posed by unconventional American defensive tactics. We will witness the development of countermeasures designed specifically to defeat James Washington's methods, and we will discover what happened when the young soldier from Alabama faced an enemy that finally understood what they were dealing with. The Battle of the Bulge was entering its most desperate phase. American forces across the Ardennes were fighting for survival against overwhelming German assault, and James Washington was about to learn that destroying tanks was only the beginning of his war. Because when the Germans figured out how a logging chain had killed their armor, they sent something far more dangerous than tanks to Hill 212. They sent men who specialized in eliminating unconventional threats. And the real battle for survival was about to begin. In parts 1 and 2, we witnessed something that military textbooks said was impossible. A 17-year-old black farm boy from Alabama named James Washington used logging chains and simple physics to destroy 3 German Panzer IV tanks without firing a single shot. His unconventional tactics disrupted German offensive operations during the opening hours of the Battle of the Bulge and attracted the attention of American military leadership. But as word of his achievement spread through both Allied and German forces, James Washington was about to face challenges far more dangerous than anything he had encountered on that frozen Belgian hillside. Because the Germans were learning, they were adapting, and they were sending specialists trained specifically to eliminate unconventional threats. This was no longer a test. This was total war. German military intelligence operated with ruthless efficiency even as their armies faced defeat on multiple fronts. Within 72 hours of Major Mueller's disastrous assault on Hill 212, detailed reports describing the loss of 3 tanks to unknown American defensive methods had reached the headquarters of Army Group B in Koblenz. The initial reaction among senior German officers was predictable skepticism. Tanks destroyed by chains sounded like the desperate fabrications of incompetent commanders seeking to excuse tactical failures. But the testimony was too consistent to dismiss. Multiple survivors from Muller's Kampfgruppe provided identical descriptions of their tanks being immobilized or destroyed by mechanical traps that exploited terrain and leverage rather than explosive force. German engineers were ordered to develop theoretical models explaining how such destruction might be possible. Their conclusions were sobering. The American tactics, while unconventional, were based on sound mechanical principles that any competent engineer could understand. The key factors were specific terrain configurations, heavy-duty chains rated for extreme loads, and precise timing that exploited the structural vulnerabilities of tanks operating on steep gradients. More importantly, the German analysts identified potential countermeasures. Tanks advancing on steep terrain should maintain greater spacing to prevent multiple vehicles from being caught in sequential traps. Crews should be trained to recognize the visual signatures of chain-based obstacles. Infantry should precede armored advances to clear potential trap locations. And most critically specialized units should be deployed to eliminate the personnel responsible for implementing these unconventional defensive methods. By December 18, 1944, just 3 days after James Washington's initial success, German countermeasures were being distributed to armored units throughout the Ardennes sector. The document, classified as Priority Intelligence, described the American chain tactics in detail and provided specific guidance for defeating them. German tank commanders were warned to avoid narrow roads on steep gradients where their vehicles would be most vulnerable. They were instructed to use artillery and infantry to clear suspected trap locations before committing armor. And they were reminded that the Americans responsible for these tactics were high-value targets, whose elimination would significantly degrade enemy defensive capabilities. The German response was not limited to defensive countermeasures. Intelligence officers identified Hill 212 as the location where the unconventional tactics had first been employed and designated it as a priority target for reconnaissance and potential special operations. If the Americans had developed a new method of destroying tanks, the Germans wanted to understand it completely. And if possible, they wanted to capture or kill the personnel responsible before the tactics could spread to other American units. The escalation was rapid and dangerous. What had begun as a desperate improvisation by a teenage farm boy had become a tactical innovation significant enough to attract the attention of German high command. James Washington did not know it yet, but he had painted a target on his own back. But this was not the only challenge facing the young soldier from Alabama. The success of James Washington's tactics on December 15th created immediate pressure for replication across American forces in the Ardennes. Lieutenant Colonel Matthews, commander of the 751st Tank Battalion, recognized the potential value of unconventional anti-tank methods and ordered James to begin training other recovery units in his techniques. The concept seemed straightforward. If one soldier could destroy 3 German tanks using chains and terrain, imagine what dozens of trained teams could accomplish across the entire front. But the reality of scaling unconventional tactics proved far more complicated than anyone anticipated. James's methods required specific conditions that were rarely present in most tactical situations. The terrain had to include steep gradients with particular curve configurations. Heavy-duty recovery chains rated for 50-ton loads were specialized equipment not available to most units. And the timing and positioning skills that James had developed through years of timber work could not be taught in a few hours of instruction. The first attempt to replicate James's tactics ended in disaster on December 19th. A recovery team from the 743rd Tank Battalion attempted to set a chain trap on a hillside near Bastogne, using techniques they had learned from a hastily prepared training document. The trap was triggered prematurely, and the chain snapped under stress, killing one American soldier and seriously injuring two others. The incident immediately raised questions about the safety and practicality of James's methods. Critics within the American command structure argued that unconventional tactics developed by a single individual under unique circumstances should not be standardized across multiple units. The risks of improper implementation outweighed the potential benefits. Some officers went further, suggesting that James Washington himself was responsible for the deaths caused by inadequate training protocols. The young soldier found himself facing scrutiny from commanders who questioned whether his initial success had been skill or simply luck. The pressure was enormous. James had gone from anonymous recovery specialist to tactical innovator to potential scapegoat in less than a week. The mechanical principles that had saved his life and destroyed German armor were now being blamed for American casualties. For the first time since arriving in Europe, James Washington began to doubt himself. Had his methods been a fluke that could never be safely replicated? Had his success created false expectations that would ultimately cost more American lives than it saved? The questions haunted him during the brief rest periods between defensive operations. But then, something happened that changed everything. On the morning of December 21, 1944, a massive German assault threatened to overrun American positions across a 15-kilometer front south of Malmedy. The attack included elements of 3 panzer divisions, supported by artillery and mechanized infantry. American forces were outnumbered and outgunned. Conventional defensive tactics were failing. And James Washington received orders that would test everything he had learned about chains physics and the brutal mathematics of survival. The German assault on December 21st was part of the broader offensive that history would remember as the Battle of the Bulge. 3 panzer divisions, over 80 tanks, thousands of infantry supported by artillery that had been pounding American positions since dawn. The objective was a critical crossroads that controlled access to the main supply routes feeding American forces throughout the central Ardennes. If the Germans captured that crossroads, they could cut off and destroy multiple American divisions. The stakes could not have been higher. Lieutenant Colonel Matthews made a desperate decision. He ordered James Washington and a reinforced team of recovery specialists to establish a defensive position on a series of ridgelines overlooking the main German approach route. Their mission was to delay the German advance long enough for American reinforcements to arrive. James had less than 4 hours to prepare. The terrain was challenging but offered possibilities. A series of steep ridges created natural choke points that would force German armor to advance along predictable routes. James immediately recognized the tactical potential. These ridges were similar to the logging slopes he had worked in Alabama. Steep gradients, narrow passages, perfect conditions for the mechanical traps that had already proven so effective against German armor. But the scale of this operation would be far greater than anything he had attempted before. James organized his team into 3 groups positioned along the expected German advance route. Each group was equipped with heavy recovery chains and instructed in the specific techniques for creating effective traps on their assigned terrain. James personally supervised the positioning of each chain system, calculating angles and stress loads with the same precision he had applied to timber operations since childhood. The preparations were completed with less than 30 minutes to spare before German forces appeared on the horizon. First came the artillery. Shells exploded across the ridgelines as German gunners attempted to suppress any American resistance. James and his team took cover in prepared positions, waiting for the bombardment to lift. The earth shook. Trees splintered. Smoke filled the air. Then the shelling stopped, and the tanks came. The lead German formation consisted of 12 Panzer IV tanks advancing in staggered column along the main road toward the first ridgeline. Behind them, more armor and infantry were visible through the morning haze. James watched through binoculars as the German column approached the first trap position. His heart was pounding, but his mind was calm, running calculations automatically. Distance, speed, gradient, timing. The lead tank reached the trigger point. James gave the signal. The first chain deployed perfectly, catching the tank's tracks at maximum gradient and creating the mechanical bind that had proven so effective on Hill 212. The Panzer IV shuddered to a halt as its left track was forced off the drive sprockets. The second tank, following too closely, struck the immobilized vehicle and became entangled in the same trap system. Two tanks disabled in less than 10 seconds. The German column halted in confusion. Tank commanders began scanning for the source of the attack, expecting anti-tank guns or hidden armor. They saw nothing. No muzzle flashes, no smoke trails from rockets. Just their lead vehicles mysteriously immobilized on a steep hillside. The third and fourth tanks attempted to bypass the disabled vehicles by moving off the main road onto the adjacent slope. This was exactly what James had anticipated. Secondary chain traps had been positioned to catch vehicles attempting this maneuver. The third tank struck a concealed chain and suffered catastrophic track failure that sent it sliding sideways down the slope into a ravine. The fourth tank managed to avoid the trap, but became bogged down in soft ground that James had identified as a natural vehicle trap during his terrain analysis. 4 German tanks eliminated or immobilized in the first 3 minutes of the engagement. The German commander ordered his remaining tanks to halt and called for infantry support to clear the suspected trap locations. This delay was exactly what James needed. Every minute the Germans spent dealing with his mechanical obstacles was another minute for American reinforcements to arrive. The pattern repeated across the next 2 hours as German forces attempted multiple approaches to the ridgelines. Each approach encountered chain traps positioned by James's teams at locations calculated to maximize mechanical advantage. Each trap disabled or destroyed German armor, using the same principles that a teenage farm boy had learned hauling timber in Alabama. By noon on December 21st, the German assault had lost 11 tanks to James Washington's unconventional defensive methods. An additional 6 tanks had been destroyed by conventional American anti-tank fire as they attempted to maneuver around the trap locations. The German advance had been delayed by over 4 hours, providing critical time for American reinforcements to reach the threatened crossroads. The German commander, recognizing that his assault had lost momentum and suffered unsustainable armor losses, ordered a withdrawal to regroup. The crossroads remained in American hands. The supply routes stayed open. And James Washington had just orchestrated the most successful unconventional anti-tank defense in the history of the European theater. News of the December 21st defensive action spread rapidly through American forces in the Ardennes. The statistics were remarkable. 11 German tanks destroyed or disabled by chain-based traps. 6 additional tanks destroyed by conventional weapons engaging targets channeled by the trap systems. A 4-hour delay imposed on a major German offensive at a critical moment in the battle. 0 American casualties among the recovery teams implementing the unconventional tactics. The contrast with the earlier training accident was stark and significant. The failed replication attempt on December 19th had involved poorly trained personnel attempting to implement techniques they did not fully understand. The successful defense on December 21st had been personally supervised by James Washington using methods refined through direct experience. The lesson was clear. Unconventional tactics required unconventional training and could not simply be distributed through written documents. Lieutenant Colonel Matthews immediately revised his approach to spreading James's methods. Instead of distributing training materials and expecting units to implement the tactics independently, he established a specialized program where James personally trained selected personnel in the specific skills required for effective chain-based anti-tank defense. The training emphasized the mechanical principles underlying the tactics rather than simply describing procedures. Trainees learned to analyze terrain for potential trap locations, calculate stress loads for different chain configurations, and recognize the timing factors that determined success or failure. Over the following weeks, James trained 47 soldiers from 8 different units in his unconventional methods. These trained specialists were then distributed across American defensive positions throughout the Ardennes, creating a network of unconventional anti-tank capability that the Germans had no effective countermeasures to defeat. The impact on German operations was devastating. By January 1945, German armored units in the Ardennes sector were reporting losses to unknown causes at rates that could not be explained by conventional American anti-tank weapons. German intelligence estimated that unconventional American defensive methods were responsible for the destruction or disabling of at least 34 tanks during the final phases of the Battle of the Bulge. More significantly, the psychological impact on German tank crews was substantial. Commanders became reluctant to advance on steep terrain without extensive infantry reconnaissance. This caution slowed German operations and reduced the effectiveness of their armored forces at precisely the moment when speed was essential for offensive success. The broader strategic impact was difficult to quantify but undeniable. The delay imposed on German forces during the critical early days of the Battle of the Bulge contributed to the ultimate failure of Hitler's last major offensive in the West. American forces held critical positions that German planners had expected to capture within 48 hours. Supply routes remained open that were supposed to be cut, and a teenage farm boy from Alabama had played a significant role in one of the most important defensive victories of World War II. James Washington received the Bronze Star for his actions on December 21, 1944. The citation praised his initiative, technical expertise, and calm performance under extreme pressure. But the official recognition only hinted at the true significance of what he had accomplished. Military historians studying the Battle of the Bulge would later identify unconventional American defensive tactics as one of several factors that contributed to the German defeat. The story of James Washington and his chain-based anti-tank methods became part of the folklore surrounding the Battle of the Bulge. Veterans who had witnessed the destruction of German armor through unconventional means told and retold the tales until the details became legendary. A teenage farm boy who destroyed tanks with logging chains, a defender who turned physics into a weapon, an underdog who proved that innovation could triumph over industrial might. But as the Battle of the Bulge wound down and American forces prepared for the final push into Germany, a question remained unanswered. What would happen to the young soldier who had changed the way armies thought about unconventional warfare? James Washington had proven that civilian skills could be applied to military problems in ways that no academy could teach. He had demonstrated that innovation often came from unexpected sources. And he had shown that one person with the right knowledge at the right moment could change the course of history. But the war was not over. And the lessons James Washington had learned on frozen Belgian hillsides would follow him for the rest of his life in ways that no one could have predicted. In Part 4, we will discover what happened to James Washington after the Battle of the Bulge. We will learn how his unconventional methods influenced American military thinking for decades to come. And we will uncover the final chapter of this remarkable story. A chapter that reveals what the teenage farm boy from Alabama did when the war ended and he returned to a country that did not always recognize the contributions of black soldiers. This story has one more chapter, and it may be the most important one of all. Let me take you back to where this incredible journey began. A 17-year-old black farm boy from rural Alabama walked into a recruitment office and lied about his age because he wanted to serve his country. 14 months later, that same young man stood on a frozen Belgian hillside and did something that military experts said was impossible. He destroyed German tanks using nothing but logging chains and the physics he had learned hauling timber down mountain slopes. His unconventional tactics disrupted German offensive operations during the Battle of the Bulge, saved countless American lives, and changed the way military planners thought about improvised warfare. James Washington proved that innovation could come from anywhere, and that civilian skills could become military weapons in the hands of someone who understood how to apply them. But what happened to the young soldier who accomplished all of this? What became of the teenage farm boy after the guns fell silent and the world moved on to peacetime concerns? This story has one final twist that almost nobody knows about. Because success sometimes comes with a price that history rarely records. The war in Europe ended on May 8, 1945, and James Washington was among the millions of American soldiers who began the long process of returning home. His service record was exemplary by any standard. Bronze Star for Valor. Multiple commendations for technical innovation. Personal recognition from Lieutenant Colonel Matthews for contributions to defensive operations during the Battle of the Bulge. On paper, James Washington was exactly the kind of soldier that America should have celebrated as a hero. But James Washington was also a black soldier, returning to the segregated South in 1946. The same country that had accepted his service, his courage, and his genius during wartime was not prepared to offer him the opportunities that white veterans received as a matter of course. The GI Bill promised education and housing benefits to returning soldiers, but many Southern institutions found ways to deny these benefits to black veterans. James returned to Huntsville, Alabama, to find that the timber operation his family had built over decades was struggling to survive. His father had died while James was overseas, and his older brothers had been unable to maintain the business without the workforce that had been depleted by the war. The young man who had destroyed German tanks and trained dozens of soldiers in unconventional warfare came home to find himself cutting timber again, using the same skills that had made him a military innovator to simply earn a living. For 3 years, James worked the family timber operation, while his white counterparts used their GI Bill benefits to attend universities and launch careers in the booming post-war economy. The injustice was profound and personal. James had risked his life for a country that treated him as a second-class citizen the moment he took off his uniform. But James Washington was not a man who accepted limitations imposed by others. In 1949, he applied to Auburn University's engineering program, using his veteran status and the educational benefits he was entitled to receive. His application was initially rejected on grounds that were never explicitly stated, but were clearly understood by everyone involved. James appealed the decision, presenting his military service record and the technical commendations he had received for his innovative work during the Battle of the Bulge. The appeal process took 18 months and required intervention from a white officer who had witnessed James's achievements firsthand. Lieutenant Robert Taylor, the tank commander who had arrived at Hill 212 to find 3 German tanks destroyed by unconventional methods, wrote a letter supporting James's application that described his technical abilities in terms that university administrators could not easily dismiss. In 1951, James Washington became one of the first black students admitted to Auburn University's engineering program. The man who had learned mechanical principles by moving logs down mountain slopes now had the opportunity to formalize his knowledge through academic study. He graduated in 1955 with a degree in mechanical engineering, specializing in stress analysis and structural failure mechanics. The theoretical frameworks he learned in university classrooms confirmed what he had always understood intuitively. Heavy objects under stress behave according to predictable principles that can be calculated and exploited by anyone who understands the underlying physics. But the true legacy of James Washington was not measured in degrees or academic achievements. It was measured in the influence his methods had on military thinking for decades after the war ended. And that influence extended far beyond what anyone could have predicted during those desperate days in the Ardennes. The unconventional anti-tank tactics that James Washington developed during the Battle of the Bulge were studied extensively by military analysts in the years following World War II. His methods were documented in technical reports that circulated through Army engineering schools and were eventually incorporated into broader discussions of improvised defensive warfare. The core principle that James had demonstrated was deceptively simple but profoundly important. Terrain and physics could be weaponized against armored vehicles by personnel who lacked conventional anti-tank weapons. This principle found application in conflicts that James himself could never have imagined when he first wrapped a logging chain around his hands on that frozen Belgian hillside. During the Korean War, American forces facing Chinese human wave attacks and North Korean armor developed improvised defensive techniques that drew directly on lessons learned from James Washington's innovations. Recovery crews were trained to view their equipment not just as tools for salvage, but as potential weapons that could be deployed in emergency defensive situations. The chain-based anti-tank methods were not widely replicated because they required specific terrain conditions that were rarely present in the Korean peninsula. But the mindset that James had pioneered became part of American military culture. The Vietnam War saw further evolution of improvised defensive concepts that traced their intellectual lineage to James Washington's innovations. Special Forces units operating in remote areas developed techniques for using available materials to create obstacles and traps that could disable enemy vehicles and channelize infantry movements. The specific methods were different, but the underlying philosophy was identical. Understand the physics of your environment and use that understanding to multiply your defensive capabilities beyond what conventional weapons alone could achieve. Military historians estimate that improvised defensive techniques derived from World War II innovations contributed to the successful defense of dozens of fire-based positions during the Vietnam conflict. The soldiers who implemented these techniques rarely knew the name James Washington, but they were applying principles that a teenage farm boy from Alabama had first demonstrated against German armor in December 1944. The influence extended beyond American forces. Military advisors shared improvised warfare concepts with allied nations throughout the Cold War period. NATO training documents from the 1960s and 1970s include sections on terrain exploitation and mechanical obstacle systems that reference the theoretical foundations James Washington had established through practical application. By conservative estimates, the defensive warfare principles that James Washington pioneered contributed to saving hundreds of lives across multiple conflicts, spanning 4 decades. The exact number is impossible to calculate, because improvised techniques are rarely documented with the same precision as conventional weapon systems. But veterans who served in Korea, Vietnam, and subsequent conflicts have consistently reported that training in improvised defensive methods gave them options they would not otherwise have possessed when facing armored threats with limited resources. The legacy extended into civilian applications as well. James Washington's post-war career in engineering led him to work on industrial safety systems that applied the same stress analysis principles he had used against German tanks. His understanding of how heavy equipment behaved under extreme conditions made him valuable to companies operating in logging, mining, and construction industries, where catastrophic mechanical failures could kill workers. James spent 35 years as an engineering consultant, helping companies understand and prevent the kinds of structural failures that he had learned to create during the war. The irony was not lost on him. But the true significance of James Washington's story was not about technical specifications or engineering principles. It was about something far more fundamental. The deeper lesson of James Washington's experience speaks to questions that extend far beyond military history. How does innovation actually happen? Where do breakthrough ideas come from? And why do institutions so often resist the very changes that could save them? James Washington was not a military academy graduate. He was not an engineer. He was not even legally an adult when he first demonstrated his unconventional anti-tank methods. He was a 17-year-old farm boy with calloused hands and an intuitive understanding of physics that came from years of dangerous practical work. The military establishment initially had no framework for recognizing the value of what he offered. His ideas sounded crazy because they came from outside the established channels of military innovation. This pattern repeats throughout history with remarkable consistency. The individuals who create breakthrough innovations are often outsiders, whose ideas are initially dismissed by experts who cannot imagine solutions coming from unexpected sources. During World War I, a British tank commander named Ernest Swinton developed infantry support tactics that senior officers rejected as impractical until battlefield experience proved him right. During World War II, an American engineer named Percy Spencer discovered microwave cooking by accident while working on radar systems. His employer initially saw no commercial application for the discovery. The pattern appears in business science and every field where innovation matters. Established experts develop blind spots created by their own expertise. They cannot see solutions that lie outside the boundaries of their training and experience. Meanwhile, outsiders who lack formal credentials sometimes possess exactly the practical knowledge needed to solve problems that experts have declared unsolvable. James Washington succeeded because he approached a military problem with a timber hauler's mindset. He did not know that tanks were supposed to be invulnerable to chains and physics, because no one had ever told him that this was impossible. His ignorance of conventional limitations allowed him to see possibilities that trained military personnel could not imagine. This is not an argument against expertise or formal education. James Washington's later engineering degree made him far more effective than he could have been with practical knowledge alone. The lesson is about the importance of diverse perspectives and the danger of assuming that innovation must come from expected sources. The military institutions that initially dismissed James's ideas eventually learned from his success and incorporated his principles into their training programs. The organizations that thrive are those that remain open to innovation regardless of its source. And there is one final detail about James Washington's story that almost nobody knows. A detail that was classified for decades and only became available to researchers in 2003 when certain World War II documents were finally declassified. The German intelligence reports analyzing the losses at Hill 212 and subsequent engagements survived the war intact. These documents were captured by American forces and eventually archived in military intelligence collections, where they remained largely unstudied for half a century. When researchers finally examined these records, they discovered something remarkable. German analysts had correctly identified the mechanical principles behind James Washington's anti-tank methods within 2 weeks of the first engagement. They had developed theoretical countermeasures and distributed guidance to tank units throughout the Western Front. But the countermeasures were never effectively implemented. The reason was bureaucratic resistance within the German military establishment. Senior German officers refused to believe that American forces had developed an effective anti-tank capability using nothing but chains and terrain. The intelligence reports were dismissed as exaggerations or errors. Tank commanders who received the countermeasure guidance ignored it because they could not imagine that the threat was real. The Germans lost additional tanks to James Washington's methods, not because they lacked the technical knowledge to defeat them, but because their institutional culture prevented them from accepting information that contradicted their assumptions about American capabilities. The ultimate irony of James Washington's story is that his success depended as much on German institutional blindness as it did on American innovation. A teenage farm boy defeated German armor not once, but repeatedly because the German military establishment could not bring itself to believe that such a thing was possible. This pattern of institutional blindness, contributing to military defeat, appears throughout history and remains relevant to modern warfare. The organizations that lose are often those that cannot adapt their thinking to unexpected threats, regardless of how much intelligence they possess about those threats. From a 17-year-old black farm boy with logging chains and an impossible idea to a military innovator who changed defensive warfare doctrine for generations. James Washington proved that breakthrough innovation can come from anyone who possesses the courage to challenge conventional thinking and the practical knowledge to back up their unconventional ideas. His methods contributed to the destruction or disabling of at least 45 German tanks during the Battle of the Bulge. His training programs equipped dozens of soldiers with skills that saved lives across multiple conflicts. His engineering principles influenced defensive warfare doctrine for 4 decades. And his personal journey from segregated Alabama to engineering consultant demonstrated that talent and determination can overcome even the most unjust obstacles. James Washington passed away in 1998 at the age of 71, surrounded by family members who had heard his war stories countless times, but never tired of the telling. His children and grandchildren remember him not as a war hero, but as a quiet man who solved problems that others said could not be solved. The recovery chains that James used on Hill 2 to 12 were eventually recovered by military historians and placed in storage at the Army Engineer Museum at Fort Leonard Wood, Missouri. They remain there today as silent testimony to what one person with the right knowledge can accomplish when faced with impossible odds. If you know similar stories of ordinary people who accomplished extraordinary things during wartime, please share them in the comments below. History is filled with innovations that came from unexpected sources and individuals whose contributions were never properly recognized. These stories deserve to be told. Make sure to subscribe to the channel for more untold stories from military history that reveal the human side of warfare. And check out the video on screen for another incredible tale of innovation against impossible odds. James Washington was asked once late in his life what he wanted people to remember about his experience in Belgium. His answer was simple and profound. He said that the chains were just tools. What mattered was understanding that every problem has a solution if you are willing to look at it from a different angle. The Germans had tanks. He had physics. And physics does not care about rank or credentials or the color of your skin. Physics just works. That is the lesson James Washington taught on a frozen hillside in December 1944. And it is a lesson that remains as relevant today as it was 80 years ago. Sometimes the most powerful weapon is not the one with the biggest gun. Sometimes the most powerful weapon is the mind that refuses to accept that a problem cannot be solved.